We're going to learn about animation. We're going to do a tour through a whole set of kind of the basics of animating in Simmetri. I started here looking at this kind of interesting view. Here is this contraption in a way. What I've got is this node emitter emitting these units plus timelines, and basically there's an animation in every one of these units, and it's probably 140 units at one time, and I'm rotating this emitter, and coming out from that emitter is, based on this rotation, is a different starting position, different starting rotation, or a different starting position for a packaged animation, which is like a unit of objects and their respective timelines. And you can see it, if I don't touch it for a while, you'll see the animation actually kind of, this is the actual unit repeating indefinitely. We're emitting from this little node down here, this emitter down here. And what you get is objects basically following this procedure. So we're going to work our way up to this, and we're going to head through the basics first. And maybe I'll teach you how I made this cool little model here, this little mesh along the way. Okay, so to do this, I'm actually going to save this as timeline, unit, timeline, tutorial. Always in the mood, always in the practice of saving. I'll save out shows. Oftentimes I'll experiment. I don't even know what to call things, so they'll end up with names like box emits other box or something like that. And then eventually I make shows using those tools. So I'm going to make a new show, and let's learn the basics of animation from the ground up, and we'll work towards this unit and timeline at the very end. So the very first way you're going to learn is we're going to do a review of what's here under the Learn menu under number 11, Keyframing with the timeline. And you can, obviously, you absolutely should watch this one and do this interactive tutorial. And I'm going to run through it kind of quickly as a review. So I'm going to grab an entity, pick whichever I want. I'm going to grab the tube because that was kind of what I was working with in the last one. Drag out to click, drag to click for center radius, and then grab to select height. I'm going to remove the rigid body entirely because we're going to kind of have these things floating in air. And when you animate, you are basically telling your animated object where it is to be in space. Now, when I say animation, I mean specifically transform animation, changing its position or its rotation. And watch when I remove the rigid attribute, the rigid body, changing its scale. So we can animate these properties through the transform, but we can animate other properties. We can animate the color as well. And any other property that has a triangle here, you'll check, and if it has new key track, you can animate it. So for example, you can animate the color with the new key track, and that's in the tutorial as well. And that'll give us a color key track. And I can also go to the triangle next to transform, controlling the position, and select new key track as well. So I'm going to animate the color, and the way that you animate on this on the timeline is double click to create a keyframe. So you're going to double click along the line that is the color key track along this line, that top column, and that puts a keyframe there. And if you right click on the keyframe, you'll see that the value that it's associating. So on this color, we start off at this default white. And then we can say that in 2 seconds, I would like us to be, and I'm going to double click it 2 seconds, and I'm going to right click on that. I'm going to right click on the key frame, and that key frame, when I right click it, it will have another property, and I'll say, at 2 seconds, I want you to be green, and we'll see what that looks like. And this is in the tutorial. At 2 seconds, we go to green. Okay, but sometimes you don't want it to jump. And so you're going to set your interpolation, and the way you interpolate between this value and this value, some programs call this a tween because it's the values between this one and this one. Interpolation, ramping is another term, your value ramps. And so if I want to access that and change my interpolation, I right click here. And when I right click, I can set an interpolation. And the default is actually step. And you have all of these available. Smooth is often, it tries to kind of smoothly move through this curve, and then it'll also try to smooth across this curve to a third. And let's see how smooth looks. So there, we're slowly getting greener. And let's say at 4 seconds, we'll double click, then right click on it. Let's say we want to come back out of green and we want to come over to red. And we right click to make an interpolation, and we'll hit smooth. And now we're going to go from white to green to red. And once you've set these values, you can always right click to reset the values, right clicking directly on the keyframe. You can also, so that'll change the value. You can also change where they are in time, right? So I can make it turn very quickly from green to red. And smooth interpolation will actually kind of change the path that it travels here to be able to smooth over into here. Think of it like a Bezier curve. So nevertheless, and then you can always change the interpolation. So you might experiment, say quadratic ease in or something. And those values you can change. You can also multi-select and move. Obviously single select and move, and then you can single select or multi-select and hold down Alt and left click the mouse to drag off clones, which means that and it'll take whatever the last interpolation is to be the default interpolation, and so it'll take smooth. So for example, we go from white, we're going to go from green to red, then back to green to red, and we could clone these out. Kind of clone out a pattern there. You can see by grabbing a certain set of values, you can start to get a repeat. Also, if you want, sort of a loop, you want this to loop. You can always click here on the key track, and there's some properties for it. So up in the properties, under this key track, under this thing, not the top one, but color. For this key track under color, I'm going to have this loop padding time, and if it's infinite, there's no padding on the loop. But basically here, if I want to say how long between this last frame when I'm red and this first frame when I'm white, how long do I want that loop to be, or how long do I want that to take before I start back at white? So let's say we want to take we're at 8 seconds. Let's do it in, we'll do it in about a second. So if we set this, scrub this up to about 1, close to 1, it'll now go from red to white, and then it begins the white to green to red loop, and you'll see it going off if I scroll out. Things to know about the timeline. I'm using the mouse scroll bar or scroll button. You can use that with a 2-finger scroll on a trackpad, scrolling up or down. Right-clicking in the as long as you're in stop time, if you right-click on the timeline, you'll be able to scroll along the time itself laterally, and then using the mouse key scroll wheel, you'll be able to zoom out, or that's 2-finger on a trackpad coming out. So that'll help you kind of navigate. And so that loop is pretty cool. And if you adjust anything between this first value and that loop value, you'll see it propagate throughout the loop. So if I change these things, anything inside of this will then get that change will propagate, which is pretty cool. So yeah, so then you can kind of set objects in this way that just lets them kind of cycle through, animations in perpetuity. You got color track. So let's take a look at the transform track. I'm going to do just a quick one here. If I double click here, that is instantiating at time 0. Let's do this in stop time. At time 0, here we want to be at this position, and at this position here in space. But if I say by 10 seconds, I want you to end up in the air, what I'll do is I'll move the time head forward to 10 seconds by clicking on this very top thin timeline row across where the numbers are. That's how you can, clicking anywhere in here doesn't do it, but if you click right there on the 10, anywhere in this track. So if I put it at 10, and then I move the timeline ahead to 10, and then I move the object's position, and then double click in this row, the row where the transform key track is, I'll now get a keyframe at this height value at 10 seconds. And so just like in the last case, nothing is changing, nothing isn't changing unless I right click in this gap between the first position and second position. I right click in between them and I put an interpolation. So if I put in smooth, it'll now smoothly rise, right? If I want it to come up. Obviously with positions, things like bounce and like elastic ease out start to look kind of cool. So these like elastic looks are kind of nice. Sort of moving things from positions, an elastic ease out, an elastic ease in will look kind of cool too. Elastic ease. So that's an elastic ease in. So an elastic ease out, you'll get that kind of look. And then an elastic ease in and out, you get takes a little while to get off the launch pad, but and then it finally does, it sort of eases into that next one. So positions will look kind of cool in that way. Again, if you want to change its position, go to stop time, and you'll notice as you come through here, it's going to take this value, and it'll, as you scrub the timeline, if I click in the timeline and hold down my left key, I can, move this timeline along, and you'll see those values driving it. So if I came out here to some future time point and then moved our object over here, I double click and then set an interpolation, we'll do elastic ease in out again. And now we're going to get kind of eases up to there. Oh, that was bounce. Sorry, what did I do? Elastic ease in and out. Oh, exponential ease in. I'm sorry. I was doing an exponential ease in and out on that first one, and that's what I meant, not elastic. So exponential ease in has got that kind of nice curve. Elastic is a little bit more cartoony, but you can have pretty good effect with that as well. And so you see the difference there of the easing curves and get that elastic. And if I right click on this, I can also set kind of the rotation too. So I'm right clicking, the transform offers me the scale and the rotation, so you can kind of get some cool stuff to happen. So that right there is the first kind of segment of this tutorial. It's sort of how you keyframe on individual levels, and you can get, you spend a Saturday morning in a pot of coffee, and you can build out some really elaborate and beautiful things pretty quickly, working with all kinds of different properties and kind of tinkering with their timings, and do those. Say, for example, import a background music track right here. You'll get the waveform, here, and you'll be off to the races of building a whole music video. One last thing I'll show you on that concept is actually taking a camera. So for like a camera fly-through effect, if I had a camera in the space, I might say, actually, and let's not use this camera. I want to use, under cameras, I'm going to use a monitor. So a monitor is this little combo pack of a camera and a sort of virtual monitor. So wherever this camera goes, this is sort of like the viewfinder or like the monitor to look at it. And so if it moves around, you get this. You can see it in real time feed out over here. Very cool. It's fed out through the camera's viewport. Oops, it's fed out through this camera viewport, and then has a display out that then becomes this display texture. And you could actually drop that display texture onto other objects, which is kind of cool. Oops, if I drew another tube, I could put the display texture on that. Just FYI. And then obviously if you put a display in front of a camera, it says like infinite hallway sort of thing, you get this recursion. It's pretty cool. You rotate it, you get these cool spiral things happening. So that's a little bit of a symmetry digression, but the point is, what we're going to do is animate this camera movement. And now you kind of see we've got this thing to kind of look at, and we're going to do camera movement in this fashion, and then we're going to learn another technique, and that's going to be pretty cool. So let's just do like a big kind of obvious like fly in. We'll just sort of fly from here to here, so you'll be able to see it on that camera. So let me get a little bit more space above the timeline for the camera to be seen. And let's do this. So the camera is going to have its transform. I'm going to click here to get a new key track for its transform. It'll show up down here. And you're going to start to see, transform key track, transform key track 2. I highly recommend doing as follows. Click on these as they come in and name them. And you'll call this the camera fly-in key track or something like that. And so now this says camera fly-in key track. And that's kind of important to keep it organized. It's not a big deal when you're only dealing with a few, but boy, when you add up a bunch of them, especially when they're the same ones, same type, you're going to want to have these things labeled out. So what I'll tend to do is just sort of name, I'll say like color ring transform key track. And then you also want to kind of keep yourself organized by coming over to your hierarchy, selecting your top item, and then changing its name maybe to kind of match this and this, their name here, their name here, the respective sort of name here. And you'll kind of keep things organized. That'll help you later on as you do more complex projects. So yeah, so let's do this camera fly-in. We've got the camera key track, so let's take its starting position. We double click right here around 0, and just a tiny bit after 0. It doesn't like it when you double click before 0, so right after 0. And then let's choose it. Let's get it to land kind of in its final position when this thing lands in its final position. So right around here, we want to be slowing to our final position on the camera. So we'll double click here. Oops, actually delete that. What you want to do is move time ahead, then move the values, and then double click. And then set interpolation. You can also set a default interpolation for your track by right-clicking out here. And anything that comes after it will sort of automatically have that interpolation embedded in it. Just a little pro tip. So now we are smoothly moving from this value to that value, and we can watch the effect right here. You see the fly-in happen right over there. Watch it again. And then, if we wanted, Oh, this monitor is not the best one to look through, so you could do it. If you want to kind of have the monitor view out. Go into that another one. But if you wanted a camera that you were going to be looking through itself, but not feeding to a monitor, you're going to want to use just a basic camera. And so you'd have the same kind of thing. Take camera 2, new key track, double click. Excuse me, I made the mistake again. Oops. Go to our fly-in position, double click, right click, set interpolation, and then on camera 2, so right here, if I double click on a keyframe, I will jump to that place in time. And then if I right click, I'm now in the camera 2's viewport and I'm affecting its transform. I can adjust its transform in real time. Call that my first frame. I'll double click to this time frame. Call this my final frame. Be about there. We'll rotate up. Oops, here. We'll rotate up. And then so I'm double clicking to get to that exact keyframe, then right clicking on it to edit it. And while I'm viewing through the camera's viewport, whose transform I'm changing, I'll see the frame that I'm on. And you'll be able to sort of stair step your way. You'll be able to kind of move your way along in animation. And then you can kind of, I just like slid the time out, and that'll make it take longer to get from the first frame to this frame. And then, yeah, so this is kind of how to use the keyframing to build out complex views. Another thing, I said that was the last thing, but there's one more thing I kind of wanted to say, is that you can also take any objects at its top level has an active property, and you can also keyframe that. So I could say, oh, I want a new, I want my new, sorry, I want my active property to be deactivated at some point, right? Or I want it to fade in, or I want something to exist or not exist. I can make a whole group of objects exist or not exist. So that's a kind of a cool thing you might want to focus on, helpful in certain ways. And then as well, I can kind of take any viewport. And this is kind of interesting. And so a viewport, if you look at its properties under its layers, there's a thing called its view layer. And this view, camera 2, you can actually change, you can make a key track for this. So that is, it selects a camera. So its view layer is what camera is feeding into my view. And this camera 2 viewport was set up by default. When you put in a camera, it sets up a default link between the camera and the viewport. So it's the view layer where that's happening. This viewport is connected to the camera 2 through its view layer view. And if I animate this, you'll see when I double click it, I have this camera 2, and if I right click, yeah, I'll see camera 2. But if at a certain point in time I want to switch to another camera, I can right click here, and we'll see this view. I can pick a different camera. I actually don't see a camera in this at this moment. So another way to actually do this is delete that. If the camera was sitting right in front of me, I would reach for it. I want to go from camera 2 to the camera 1. And so what I want to do is grab camera, and I can drag camera onto right here, and it makes a little keyframe, and you'll see that in viewport 2, I'm going to go from that view to this view. And it's actually, let's reverse those. We'll put, you can always drag one keyframe across the other one and flip things around. So what happens is, in this case, I'm zooming in. Oh, it starts there. So here, let me actually start. Just cloned away the last one. So we're going to be at this view, then we're going to be at this other fly-in view, and then we're back to the other view. They're actually fairly similar views. So here's maybe we zoom one of these way out or something and put it like way up in the air. Put it over here. And put that back, put it like this. So you can like now switch the angles of the viewports, kind of controlling the viewport's view layer. So those are some pretty cool techniques that involve animating values. Now I'm going to set this as the active viewport, the primary one, terrain space, so I can, when I press play, I watch it from here, and you can see these cameras animated here. So yeah, so we've used the timeline to really bring some things to life here. I'm going to show you one other technique that uses the timeline, and I'm going to grab a new object to demonstrate that. So this is a live recording technique, let's take a cone to do that. And on this case, again, I'm going to I'll make a new color, and I will I'm going to completely remove its rigid body because I'm going to animate its position as well. And in this case, what I'm going to do is unselect all of these. So this is showing that I'm recording and playing back these key tracks. And what I want to do is I want to record down the position of this object. And I'm going to move it around with my mouse. And we have the VR version for this as well, which we'll teach in a separate video. But what I'm going to do is move this around and record it in real time. So to do that, what I need to do is create a transform key track. So we've got our cone. It's got its rigid body moved. I'm going to make a new key track for it. I'll call this one cone transform key track. And then I'm going to turn off these record layers because I'm going to be just recording values for this this object here, the cone. So then what you do is you hold down this record button with your left mouse, hold it down until it's blinking. And once it's blinking, when you press play, this object, you'll see these keyframes start to lay down whenever I move it. And you can press spacebar to pause, and then when you stop, the recording will be done. And now you'll have these values baked in, these like position values, and it records at 60 frames a second. And you can, of course, then edit them, like bring them over, multi-select and slide them. So one of the techniques I would recommend, I'm going to delete these just to demonstrate that, is before, set up double click to get your first position set up, right click on the right side of it and set an interpolation. That way when you record, all the keyframes that come off of that are going to have that interpolation between them as well. And so if there's any little gaps between the keyframes, the interpolation will it'll have inherited that interpolation, and you'll see that smooth, for example, is a really basically probably the best one to work with in that case. So the workflow would be set your transform key track, double click, double click to get one key track in, right click to set interpolation, hold down this button to record, play, move, stop. And you can do that as well for other values. You could move, slider values around, and they will also get recorded here. And that's an interesting technique. So I will click all of these back on, so that these key tracks are now live. You can kind of see the compound effort of my result of my efforts here. Those are some basics. And now we're going to move into unit plus timeline. And I'm going to do that in a separate video. And yeah, so check that one out next.